The clock on the kitchen wall read 11:47 p.m. when Sarah first heard the crash. It wasn't the gentle sound of something accidentally knocked over. It was the violent, intentional destruction of something precious. She froze mid-step on the stairs, her hand gripping the wooden banister so tightly her knuckles turned white. The sound came again, followed by a deep, guttural voice that made her stomach drop. It was him. He was home, and he was angry. Sarah's heart began to race in that peculiar way it did when she knew danger was approaching. Over the past year, she'd learned to recognize the signs, the aggressive tone, the heavy footsteps, the way he slammed doors like he was trying to break them from their hinges. She'd become an expert at reading the atmosphere, at sensing when the household was about to shift from peaceful to chaotic. Tonight, something felt different. Tonight felt worse. 3-year-old Emma was sleeping in her bedroom down the hall, her favorite stuffed bunny tucked under one arm, her blonde hair splayed across her pillow like a golden halo. She was innocent and vulnerable in that way only children could be, completely unaware of the storm about to descend upon their home. Sarah's maternal instinct kicked into overdrive. She had to protect her daughter. She had to keep her safe from whatever was about to unfold. From downstairs came the unmistakable sound of bottles breaking, glass shattering against the kitchen floor. Sarah heard his voice now, slurred and aggressive, speaking words that were meant to wound. He was drunk, heavily, dangerously drunk. This was worse than the usual arguments. This had a different quality to it, a violence underlying every syllable. Sarah descended the stairs slowly, carefully, trying to assess the situation without making it worse. When she reached the kitchen, she found him standing amid the wreckage of what had once been their wedding china, plates her grandmother had given them, dishes they'd used for every important family meal. He'd deliberately thrown them, every single one. His face was flushed, his eyes wild, his jaw clenched with an anger that seemed to come from somewhere deep and dark inside him. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, her voice steady even though fear was coursing through her veins like ice water. She'd learned that showing fear only escalated his aggression. He turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that terrified her more than any broken dish ever could. It was the look of someone who'd completely lost control, who'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. His eyes were devoid of the man she'd once loved, the man she'd married, the man she'd thought would be a good father to their daughter. "You know what?" he slurred, his words running together like melting wax. "I'm done with you, done with this pathetic life, done with pretending." Sarah's blood ran cold. Done with what with us? He picked up another plate, one of the few that remained, and hurled it against the wall with such force that it shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. "Done with everything. You think I want this? You think I want to be stuck here with you and that kid?" The way he said that kid struck Sarah like a physical blow. That kid, their daughter, the child he'd promised to love and protect. The realization hit her then with terrible clarity. He'd never wanted to be a father. He'd never truly wanted her. He'd been playing a role, and tonight the mask had finally slipped. "You need to stop," Sarah said firmly, moving toward him. "You're scaring me." "Scaring you?" he laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the kitchen. "Good, you should be scared. You should be terrified of what I'm capable of." That was when Emma's cry pierced through the chaos, a small, frightened wail from upstairs. She'd heard the noise. She'd woken up, and now, terrified and alone in her bedroom, she was calling for her mother. "Mommy," Emma's voice was thin and high-pitched, the sound of a child who just realized the world wasn't safe. "Mommy, I'm scared." Sarah's maternal instinct overrode every other thought in her mind. She turned away from the man standing amid the broken dishes and ran for the stairs. She could hear him shouting behind her, but she didn't care. Nothing mattered except reaching her daughter. She found Emma standing in the middle of her bedroom, tears streaming down her small face, her body trembling violently. Sarah scooped her up immediately, holding her tight against her chest, whispering reassurances into her hair. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here. You're safe. You're safe." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew they weren't entirely true. Emma wasn't safe. Not in this house. Not with him. The sounds from downstairs continued, more crashing, more shouting, more destruction. Sarah carried Emma to the kitchen corner, crouching down behind the counter, creating a small fortress of her own body around her daughter. "Close your eyes, sweetheart," Sarah whispered. "Don't look, just listen to Mommy's voice." Emma buried her face in her mother's chest, her small body shaking with sobs that seemed too big for such a tiny person to contain. She didn't understand what was happening. She only knew that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. The safe place she'd known her whole life had become dangerous and unpredictable. Sarah held her daughter and made a decision in that moment, a decision that would change both their lives forever. She couldn't stay. She couldn't subject Emma to this anymore. Whatever it took, whatever she had to do, she would get her daughter out of this house and away from this man. She would protect her, even if it meant facing her biggest fears, even if it meant taking him to court, even if it meant forcing Emma to relive this nightmare in testimony. In that moment, hiding behind the kitchen counter with her daughter sobbing in her arms, Sarah didn't know that help was on the way. She didn't know that within minutes, sirens would wail down their street. She didn't know that officers would storm through their front door. She didn't know that this terrible night would eventually lead to a courtroom, a judge, and a dog named Duke who would change everything. All she knew was that she loved her daughter more than she'd ever loved anything in her entire life, and she would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The morning of the hearing arrived with a gray sky that seemed to match Sarah's mood perfectly. She'd barely slept the night before, lying awake replaying conversations with her lawyer, Dr. Patterson, the child psychologist, and the victim advocate assigned to their case. Everyone had given her the same advice: prepare Emma as much as possible, but don't force her. Let her know what to expect. Make it seem less frightening by explaining the process in terms a 3-year-old could understand. Sarah had tried. She'd sat with Emma on her bed the previous evening, showing her pictures of the courthouse on her laptop, the marble floors, the wooden benches, the judge's bench elevated high above everything else. Emma had listened quietly, her small face serious in a way that broke Sarah's heart. No child should have to prepare for something like this. No child should have to bear this burden. Now, as they sat in the courthouse parking lot, Sarah could feel Emma's anxiety radiating off her like heat from a furnace. Her daughter was dressed in a new pink dress. Sarah had thought bright colors might help Emma feel braver, might remind her that there was still beauty in the world despite everything that had happened. Emma's blonde hair was braided carefully, and she wore white socks pulled up to her knees. She looked like any other 3-year-old preparing for a special occasion, except her eyes told a different story. Those eyes had seen things no child should see. "Okay, baby," Sarah said, turning around in her seat to face Emma in the back. "We're going to go inside the big building now. Remember what I told you about it." Emma nodded slowly, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, a habit she'd developed since that terrible night. Sarah didn't correct her. Regression was normal, the therapist had said. Emma was regressing to cope with stress. "There's going to be a lady called a judge," Sarah continued, keeping her voice calm and cheerful even though her own heart was hammering against her ribs. "She sits up high so everyone can see her, but she's actually very nice. She wants to help you." "Will Daddy be there?" Emma asked quietly, her voice muffled around her thumb. This was the question Sarah had been dreading. She'd practiced her answer 100 times, trying to find the perfect balance between honesty and reassurance. "Daddy will be there, yes," Sarah said gently. "But there will be a lot of people between you and him. He won't be able to come near you. You'll be safe the whole time. Mommy will be right there, and there will be police officers and other grown-ups whose job is to keep you safe." Emma's eyes widened slightly. "Police officers?" "Yes, sweetie, the same kind of people who came to our house that night. They're the good guys, they help people." Emma seemed to process this information, her small brow furrowing in concentration. Sarah reached back and squeezed her daughter's tiny hand. "You're so brave, Emma, the bravest girl I know." But even as she said it, Sarah worried it wasn't true. Emma wasn't brave. Emma was terrified. And Sarah was asking her to be brave, which felt like asking her to be something she wasn't capable of being. They walked through the parking lot slowly, Sarah's hand never leaving Emma's. The courthouse loomed ahead of them, an imposing structure of marble and stone that seemed designed to intimidate. Gray stone steps led up to massive wooden doors. The building looked like it could swallow people whole. As they approached the entrance, Sarah's lawyer, Tom Richardson, appeared beside them. He was a kind man in his 50s, someone who'd been working with custody cases for 30 years. He'd warned Sarah that this would be difficult, that Emma might struggle, but that her testimony could make all the difference. "Ready?" Tom asked, looking down at Emma with a gentle smile. "Hi, Emma, remember me? I'm Mr. Tom. I'm going to help you tell the judge what you know." Emma nodded but didn't speak. Her grip on Sarah's hand had become almost painful. Inside the courthouse, everything echoed. Their footsteps bounced off marble floors. Voices carried strangely through the cavernous space. Emma's eyes grew wider with each step. They passed through security where officers in uniform checked bags and asked questions. Emma seemed even more frightened by them, despite Sarah's earlier explanation. These weren't the officers who'd come to help that night. These were strangers in uniforms, and to Emma, uniforms now meant chaos and danger. The waiting area outside the courtroom was filled with other people, lawyers in dark suits speaking in hushed tones, witnesses waiting nervously, family members of various parties involved in cases. It was a microcosm of human suffering and conflict, and it was overwhelming even for adults. For a 3-year-old, it must have felt like standing in the middle of a thunderstorm. Sarah found a quiet corner and sat with Emma on a hard wooden bench. She opened a coloring book she'd brought, one with pictures of puppies and rainbows, and tried to keep Emma distracted. But Emma's hand trembled so badly she could barely hold the crayon. The colors went everywhere but on the paper. "It's okay," Sarah whispered, taking the crayon gently from Emma's hand. "You don't have to color right now. Let's just sit together." Tom appeared at their side. "We're going to go in about 10 minutes. I want to prepare you both for what the room looks like." He described the courtroom in detail. The judge's bench that was very high up, the tables where the lawyers sat, the witness stand where Emma would sit, the rows of benches where spectators watched. He explained that the judge would ask Emma questions, and Emma should answer truthfully. "Is it scary?" Emma asked, her voice so small it was almost inaudible. Tom knelt down to meet Emma at eye level. "It might be a little scary," he said honestly, "but there will be a lot of people there whose job is to make sure you're okay, and your mom will be right there. You're not alone." Sarah appreciated his honesty. Lying to Emma would only make it worse when she experienced the reality of the courtroom. As the time approached, Sarah's own anxiety began to peak. She kept thinking about what could go wrong. What if Emma froze? What if she cried so hard she couldn't speak? What if the opposing counsel, a man named Richard Hutchins who'd been surprisingly aggressive in his depositions, tried to confuse her or make her doubt her own memories? What if the judge didn't believe her because she was so young? A court officer appeared at their side. "We're ready for you." Sarah took Emma's hand and together they stood up. Emma's legs seemed unsteady beneath her, as if they might give out at any moment. Sarah squeezed her hand reassuringly, though she was anything but reassured herself. They walked toward the courtroom doors. They were large, heavy wooden doors with brass handles. They looked like the entrance to some kind of fortress or a prison. Sarah pushed one open, and immediately the full weight of what was about to happen crashed down on her. The courtroom was exactly as Tom had described it, but no description could have prepared Emma for the reality of it. It was enormous. The ceiling stretched impossibly high. Rows of wooden benches filled most of the space, and at the front, elevated on a platform, was the judge's bench. It looked like a throne. Everyone in the courtroom turned to look at them. Sarah felt every eye in the room land on her daughter, this tiny, terrified 3-year-old girl who was about to try to do the impossible. Emma's grip on Sarah's hand became vice-like. The witness stand seemed to grow taller the closer Emma got to it. What Sarah had thought was just a small elevated platform now appeared to be a mountain. 3 wooden steps led up to a chair that looked enormous compared to Emma's tiny frame. A court officer approached them and gestured for Sarah to stop. "Only the witness goes up," the officer said kindly, but the words hit Sarah like a punch. She couldn't go with her. Emma would have to climb those steps alone, sit in that massive chair alone, and face all these strangers alone. "It's okay, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, kneeling down to Emma's level. She smoothed her daughter's already perfect hair and tried to smile reassuringly. "You're so brave. You're going to do great. Just answer Mr. Tom's questions honestly. That's all you have to do." Emma's lip began to quiver. "I want you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I want Mommy." Sarah felt her own eyes fill with tears, but she forced them back. She had to be strong for Emma. She had to project confidence even though her insides were screaming. "I know, baby. I'll be right over there," Sarah pointed to the gallery where she'd be sitting. "I can see you the whole time. You're not alone. You're never alone." But even as she said it, Sarah knew that in some fundamental way, Emma would be alone. You couldn't hold your parents' hand when you were testifying. You couldn't ask them for help when you forgot what you were supposed to say. You couldn't crawl into their lap when the fear became too much. You were alone in that chair, under those lights, with all those eyes watching. An officer gently took Emma's small hand and began to help her up the steps. Sarah watched, her heart shattering with every step her daughter took. Emma climbed slowly, her movements hesitant, as if each step required an enormous amount of courage. When she reached the top, the officer helped her into the chair. Emma looked impossibly small in it. Her feet didn't even reach the footrest. She had to stretch her neck to see over the desk in front of her. The clerk approached with the Bible, a large, leather-bound book that looked ancient and intimidating. "Place your hand on the Bible and raise your right hand," the clerk instructed. Emma, confused, looked at her hands as if she didn't know which was her right. The clerk gently guided her hand onto the Bible. Emma's hand looked like a doll's hand against the massive book. "Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" The clerk asked in a formal, robotic voice that sounded like it had been rehearsed 10,000 times. Emma stared at her, her mouth opening and closing silently. She didn't understand what swear meant. She didn't know what affirm meant. All she knew was that she was sitting in a strange chair, in a strange place with everyone watching her. "Just say I do," Tom said gently, his voice trying to sound encouraging. I do," Emma whispered, so quietly that several people in the courtroom leaned forward to hear her. The clerk stepped away, and suddenly, Emma was truly alone in that chair. Tom stood at his podium, papers in hand, and Sarah could see him taking a breath, preparing himself for the testimony that would be crucial to their case. "Emma, my name is Tom Richardson, and I'm going to ask you some questions, okay?" he began, his voice gentle and measured. He was using his child voice, a special tone he'd practiced specifically for this testimony. "Is that okay with you?" Emma nodded but didn't speak. "I need you to say yes or no out loud so the lady taking notes can write down your answer," Tom explained. "Yes," Emma whispered. "Good girl. Now, Emma, do you know what it means to tell the truth?" Emma nodded, then quickly added yes. Sarah watched her daughter's small face, saw the tension in her tiny shoulders, the way her hands gripped the sides of the chair. Every muscle in Emma's body seemed to be screaming with anxiety. "Emma, where do you live?" Tom asked. With Mommy," Emma answered, her voice barely audible. "And does anyone else live with you and your mommy?" There was a long pause. Emma's eyes darted around the courtroom, and Sarah saw them land on her father, who was sitting at the defendant's table with his lawyer. The man's expression was neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were clenched into fists beneath the table. Emma's breathing became faster, shallower. "Emma," Tom prompted gently, "does anyone else live with you?" Daddy used to," Emma said, her voice even quieter now. But he made Mommy sad." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. This was it. This was the moment Emma was admitting what she'd witnessed, what she'd experienced. But even as she felt hope, she also felt Emma's distress radiating across the courtroom. "Can you tell me about a time when Daddy made Mommy sad?" Tom asked carefully. Emma's face began to crumple. Her lower lip started to shake violently. Sarah could see her daughter's breathing becoming increasingly irregular, quick, panicked breaths that suggested she was hyperventilating. "Emma," Tom said, his voice taking on a note of concern, "are you okay?" But Emma wasn't okay. She was beginning to spiral. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep them on the chair. Her eyes were filling with tears that began to spill down her cheeks. I can't." Emma's words came out as broken fragments. "It's okay, Emma. You're doing great, just take a deep breath." But Emma couldn't take a deep breath. She was caught in the grip of panic that was overwhelming her tiny nervous system. The memories were flooding back. The sounds of breaking glass, her father's angry voice, the feeling of being terrified and helpless. No, I can't," Emma cried out, her voice suddenly louder, more desperate. "I don't want to, I want Mommy." Sarah stood up immediately. The judge looked at her sharply, but Sarah couldn't help it. Her child was having a panic attack in front of the entire courtroom. "Your Honor, the witness appears to be in distress," Tom said, looking genuinely concerned. Judge Patricia Morrison, the presiding judge, leaned forward on her bench. She'd been watching Emma carefully, and Sarah could see the moment compassion overtook protocol in her expression. "We'll take a recess," the judge announced, striking her gavel against the sound block. "Court is in recess for 15 minutes. Sarah rushed toward the witness stand, and the court officer helped Emma down from the chair. The moment Emma's feet touched the ground, she ran toward her mother, her entire body shaking with sobs that seemed far too large for such a small person to contain. Sarah scooped her up and held her against her chest, feeling her daughter's tears soaking through her blouse. Emma's small arms wrapped around her neck with a grip that suggested she might never let go again. "I'm sorry, Mommy. I'm sorry, I couldn't do it, I couldn't," Emma wailed into Sarah's shoulder. SHH, it's okay, baby. You didn't do anything wrong," Sarah whispered, but her words felt hollow. Emma had done nothing wrong, but the system was punishing her for being too traumatized to function in it. In the hallway, Sarah held her daughter and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't working. Forcing Emma to relive her trauma in front of all these strangers wasn't helping. It was hurting her. But what choice did they have? As she stood there, holding her sobbing daughter, Sarah didn't know that help was on its way. She didn't know that when they returned to that courtroom, everything was about to change in ways she couldn't have imagined. The 15-minute recess turned into 30 minutes. Sarah sat in a small witness waiting room with Emma, trying to calm her daughter down. Emma's breathing was still irregular, her body still trembling with the aftermath of her panic attack. Sarah had called the victim advocate, a woman named Michelle, who rushed to their side with water and tissues. "This is completely normal," Michelle said, though her worried expression suggested she didn't entirely believe her own words. Many trauma survivors react this way when forced to discuss their experiences in a formal setting. The important thing is that Emma knows she's safe now. But Emma didn't feel safe. Emma felt like her body had betrayed her. She tried to be brave, tried to answer the questions, and her own nervous system had shut down. Now she was afraid that she'd failed, that she'd let her mother down, that the bad man would win because she couldn't do what was asked of her. Sarah held Emma close, whispering reassurances into her hair. "You didn't fail, baby. You're so brave. You're the bravest girl in the whole world." But even as she said these things, Sarah's mind was racing with darker thoughts. What if Emma couldn't testify? What if her trauma was too severe? The opposing counsel would use that against them. He'd argue that Emma's inability to testify proved she was too emotionally unstable to be a reliable witness. He might even use it to suggest that Sarah had coached Emma, had traumatized her further by forcing her to relive events. There was a knock on the door and Tom Richardson entered, his expression grave. Behind him came Michelle, the victim advocate, and surprisingly, the judge herself, Judge Patricia Morrison. Sarah stood immediately, startled. Judges didn't typically come to witness waiting areas during recesses. Judge Morrison was a woman in her late 50s, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested she'd seen much in her years on the bench. She looked at Emma with an expression that was part concern, part something else, something Sarah couldn't quite identify. "Mrs. Chen," the judge said, addressing Sarah directly, "I'd like to discuss what just happened. May I sit down?" Sarah nodded, and the judge sat across from them. Emma buried her face in Sarah's shoulder, peeking out only slightly to look at this authority figure who'd been so intimidating moments before. Emma's reaction is not unusual for a young child who's experienced trauma, Judge Morrison began, her voice surprisingly gentle. "I've been on the bench for 28 years, and I've seen many witnesses respond this way. The formal courtroom environment can be overwhelming, especially for children." Sarah felt a small glimmer of hope. Was the judge going to dismiss the case? Would she rule in their favor because Emma's reaction was symptomatic of genuine trauma? "However," the judge continued, and Sarah's hope dimmed slightly, "we still need to hear Emma's account of what happened. Without her testimony, the court is at a disadvantage in making a decision about custody that's in her best interest." The judge paused, her eyes moving away from Sarah and focusing on Emma. She studied the little girl for a long moment, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. "Emma," Judge Morrison said gently, "can you look at me for a moment?" Emma slowly lifted her head, her tear-stained face just barely visible. Her eyes were red and puffy, her cheeks blotchy from crying. "I want you to know that you're very brave for trying to answer my questions," the judge said. "Sometimes our bodies get scared even when our hearts are brave. Is that what happened to you?" Emma nodded slowly, seeming to understand something in the judge's words that no one else had managed to convey. "I'm going to try something that might make this easier for you," Judge Morrison continued. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through several screens. "Have you ever seen a police dog before, Emma?" Emma shook her head, but Sarah saw a flicker of interest cross her daughter's face. Police dogs. That was different from the scary men in uniforms who'd filled their house with sirens and shouting. "There's a very special police dog here at the courthouse," the judge continued. "His name is Duke, and his job is to help people who are scared. Would you like to meet him?" Emma's eyes widened slightly. A dog." Her voice was small but no longer quite as terrified. "Yes, a very good dog, a very kind dog. Would you like to meet him?" Sarah's mind was reeling. Was the judge really suggesting bringing a dog into the courtroom? Was that even allowed? But as she thought about it, she realized she'd read something about facility dogs in courtrooms. They were trained animals specifically for this purpose, to help anxious witnesses access their own courage. "Can Mommy come?" Emma asked, still worried about being separated from her mother. "Your mother will be nearby," the judge assured her. "But I think Duke's job is to stay with you while you answer questions. Dogs are very good at helping people feel brave." Emma looked up at her mother, seeking permission and reassurance. Sarah nodded, even though she had no idea if this would work, but she was willing to try anything at this point. Judge Morrison stood up and made a phone call. Within minutes, there was a knock on the door. Officer Martinez, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, entered with a dog on a leash. The moment Sarah saw Duke, she felt something shift inside her. The dog was magnificent, a German shepherd with a black and tan coat that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. But what struck her most was the dog's demeanor. Duke didn't seem agitated or energetic. He walked with a calm, purposeful gait, his intelligent eyes surveying the room with quiet confidence. This was an animal that had been trained extensively, that understood his role, that carried himself with quiet authority. Emma's tear-filled eyes followed the dog. Her breathing, which had been rapid and panicked moments before, began to slow slightly. "This is Officer Martinez and Duke," Judge Morrison explained. "Duke has a special certificate that allows him to help people in court. He's helped 17 other people tell the truth, and he's very, very good at his job." Officer Martinez knelt down slightly so Emma could see Duke better. "Duke is trained to help kids who are feeling scared," he said in a warm, reassuring voice. "His favorite thing in the whole world is helping kids be brave. Would you like to say hi to him?" Emma hesitated, then slowly reached out her hand. Duke's head turned toward her, and he seemed to understand immediately that this was a child who needed his particular brand of comfort. He remained perfectly still as Emma's small fingers touched his fur. The moment her hand made contact with Duke's coat, Sarah saw something change in her daughter. It was subtle, a slight relaxation of her shoulders, a quieting of her breathing, a softening of her expression. Emma's fingers buried themselves in Duke's fur, and the dog leaned slightly toward her, as if affirming her bravery. "Duke is going to sit right next to you while you answer questions," Officer Martinez explained. "If you get scared, you can touch him and he'll help you be brave. That's his job. He's really, really good at it." Emma looked at the dog, then at her mother, then back at the dog. She seemed to be making a decision, weighing her fear against this new possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could do this with help. "Okay," Emma whispered. "Okay, I'll try." Judge Morrison smiled, and Sarah saw genuine warmth in her expression. "I think that's very wise, Emma. You're very brave. Now, let's go back into the courtroom and try this again. With Duke's help, I think you might be surprised at what you can do." As they stood to return to the courtroom, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Real, tangible hope. Duke walked calmly beside Emma, the leash held loosely by Officer Martinez. The dog seemed to understand that he was the important one now, that this small girl was counting on him, that his presence alone could make a difference. Sarah squeezed Emma's other hand, and together they walked back toward the courtroom. She didn't know what was about to happen, but she knew one thing: her daughter was no longer going in alone. The courtroom doors loomed ahead as they approached, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Word of the judge's unconventional decision had spread quickly through the courthouse staff. As Sarah, Emma, Officer Martinez, and Duke walked through the doors, she could sense the collective pause in the room, the moment when everyone registered that a dog was being brought into the proceedings. The opposing counsel, Richard Hutchins, stood up immediately. "Your Honor, I object to the presence of an animal in these proceedings. This is highly irregular and could influence the witness." Judge Morrison raised her hand. "Counsel, facility dogs are legally permitted in courtrooms under Ohio Revised Code Section 109.541. Officer Martinez and Duke are certified through the K-9 Companions Program, which meets all state requirements. Your objection is noted and overruled. Please be seated." Hutchins sat back down, his jaw clenched with frustration. He'd lost his first tactical advantage, and he knew it. Officer Martinez led Duke to the witness stand, which now seemed less like a mountain and more like just a small platform. The court officer helped Emma climb the steps again, but this time, Duke walked beside her. The dog moved with such calm assurance that Emma's own steps seemed to match his rhythm. It was as if Duke was lending her some of his composure, transferring his confidence into her small body through their physical proximity. Once Emma was seated in the chair, Officer Martinez positioned Duke directly beside the witness stand, close enough that Emma could easily reach down and touch him. The dog settled into a perfect sit, his body language communicating complete readiness to support whatever came next. Sarah watched from the gallery, her hands clasped so tightly together they ached. She held her breath, waiting to see if this would actually work or if it was just an experiment doomed to fail. Tom Richardson stood and began again, restarting his questioning from the beginning. "Emma, can you tell me your name?" There was a pause. Emma's hand dropped down to Duke's fur, her fingers tangling gently in the soft coat. The dog's tail wagged once, a subtle movement that seemed to acknowledge her touch. "Emma Chen," she said, her voice still quiet but noticeably steadier than before. "Good, Emma, and how old are you?" "I'm 3, Emma said, and this time there was almost a note of confidence in her voice. As if by touching Duke, she'd borrowed some of his strength. Tom continued with basic questions: where she lived, who lived with her, what she liked to eat. Simple questions designed to help Emma warm up to the process. And with each answer, Sarah noticed a subtle shift in her daughter. Emma's shoulders straightened slightly. Her voice grew a tiny bit louder. Her grip on Duke's fur became less desperate and more comforting, as if she was no longer holding on for dear life, but rather drawing strength from a trusted friend. The judge watched intently, her expression unreadable but thoughtful. After about 5 minutes of these foundational questions, Tom gently guided the conversation toward that fateful night. "Emma, I want to ask you about something that happened a few weeks ago. Do you remember when Daddy was at your house at nighttime?" Emma's entire body tensed. Her hand immediately gripped Duke's fur more tightly. The dog, sensing her distress, shifted his weight slightly so that more of his body was pressed against the witness stand, creating a physical barrier between Emma and the rest of the courtroom. "It's okay," Tom said gently. "Duke is right there with you. Can you tell me what happened that night?" Emma took a shaky breath. Her eyes were fixed on Duke's face, and the dog gazed back at her with such understanding that Sarah felt tears pricking her own eyes. "Daddy he was loud," Emma said slowly, each word seeming to require effort. "He was very loud and he was angry." "What did he do when he was angry?" Emma's lip trembled, but she didn't look away from Duke. It was as if the dog was anchoring her to the present moment, reminding her that she was safe now, that what she was describing had already happened and couldn't hurt her anymore. "He broke things," Emma said. "He broke the pretty plates, and he said mean words, he said." Emma paused, struggling with the adult language she'd heard that night. "He said he didn't want me anymore." A profound silence fell over the courtroom. Even the court stenographer seemed to pause in her typing, affected by the weight of those words coming from such a small mouth. Sarah's heart shattered into a million pieces. Those words, "he didn't want me anymore," weren't just a description of what Emma had heard. They were the emotional wound that had been inflicted on her daughter. Emma had interpreted her father's words to mean that she herself was unwanted, that she was somehow the problem. Tom's voice, when he spoke again, was thick with emotion. "How did that make you feel, Emma?" Emma's hand found Duke's ear, gently stroking it. The dog remained perfectly still, his entire focus on the little girl beside him. It was as if he understood that this moment was crucial, that his unwavering presence could make the difference between Emma finding her voice and losing it forever. "Scared," Emma whispered. "I was very scared and sad. I wanted Mommy." "And what did you do?" "I hid," Emma said. "I went behind the counter in the kitchen and I hid." "And did Mommy find you?" "Yes," Emma said, and for the first time there was a note of something like relief in her voice. "Mommy came and held me, and she said I was safe." The opposing counsel sat rigidly in his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating. He'd come prepared to cross-examine a traumatized, unreliable 3-year-old who would likely break down under questioning. Instead, he was faced with a child who was speaking with remarkable clarity and honesty, A child who had the calm, steady presence of a trained service dog to help her access her own truth. Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Emma's face. Sarah could see that the judge was deeply affected by what she was hearing. This wasn't just testimony anymore. This was a child finally being heard, finally being believed, finally being allowed to tell her truth. "Emma," Tom continued, "did Daddy ever touch you in ways that made you uncomfortable?" This was the crucial question, the one that could determine the outcome of the entire case. Emma's hand stilled on Duke's ear. Her eyes closed for a moment, and Sarah could see her gathering her courage, summoning whatever inner strength a 3-year-old could possibly possess. When Emma opened her eyes again, they were wet with tears, but they were also clear and determined. Duke's tail wagged once, twice, 3 times, as if the dog was silently cheering her on, affirming her bravery. "Yes," Emma said, her voice small but absolutely certain. "He did, and it hurt, and it scared me, and I told Mommy." The words hung in the air like a bell that had been struck, resonating through the entire courtroom. The stenographer's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word. The judge's expression hardened into something more focused, more protective. The gallery members who'd been neutral observers now sat with expressions of shock and sympathy. Tom paused, giving Emma a moment to breathe. "You did so good, Emma. I'm so proud of you. Duke is proud of you too." As if on cue, Duke turned his head and gently pressed his nose against Emma's arm, a gesture so tender, so perfect, that several people in the courtroom wiped away tears. Emma, for the first time since entering the courtroom, managed a small smile. She reached down and wrapped her small arms around Duke's neck in a tight hug. The dog remained completely still, accepting the embrace with the patience of an animal that understood exactly what this child needed in this moment. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as a 3-year-old girl and a trained service dog created a moment of such profound human connection that it seemed to transcend the formal, often cold proceedings of the legal system. Judge Morrison, Sarah, Tom, Officer Martinez, and even some of the court staff were visibly moved. In that moment, everyone understood something fundamental. Emma wasn't just a witness. She was a brave, resilient child who'd found her voice with the help of an unexpected ally. And that voice was going to change everything. Tom Richardson allowed a respectful moment of silence to pass before continuing. He understood that what had just happened was significant, not just legally, but emotionally and psychologically. Emma had crossed a threshold. She'd moved from panic to clarity, from terror to courage. Now he needed to carefully guide her through the rest of her testimony while maintaining this hard-won stability. "Emma," Tom said gently, "I know you've been very brave already. Can you tell me more about what happened that night? Take your time. Duke is right there with you." Emma's fingers remained tangled in Duke's fur, and the dog's calm presence seemed to give her permission to continue. She took a shaky breath and began to speak, her words coming in a halting but determined stream. "Daddy picked me up," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. He was different. He smelled funny, like the stuff in the big bottles." Someone in the gallery whispered something to their neighbor, likely identifying the funny smell as alcohol. Sarah felt her chest tighten. This was the physical evidence of her ex-husband's intoxication, coming directly from their daughter's honest observation. "What happened after Daddy picked you up?" Tom asked carefully, ensuring he wasn't leading the witness but allowing her to tell her own story. He was touching me in my private places," Emma said, the words coming slowly, as if she'd been taught to say them in these clinical terms during her sessions with Dr. Patterson. "And it hurt, and it felt bad, and I told him to stop." "What did Daddy do when you told him to stop?" Emma's grip on Duke's fur tightened, and the dog responded by shifting his weight closer to her, his massive body providing a shield of comfort. "He said I was a bad girl," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said nobody would believe me, He said if I told Mommy, he would take me away from her. The courtroom erupted in subtle reactions, sharp intakes of breath, hands covering mouths, the judge's expression hardening further. These were the manipulation tactics of an abuser, isolating the victim, threatening loss, creating shame and silence. Richard Hutchins stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I object. This entire testimony is clearly coached. A 3-year-old couldn't possibly articulate this narrative without adult influence." "Counsel," Judge Morrison interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "This witness has been evaluated by a court-appointed child psychologist and has been found to be competent to testify. The court is well aware of how trauma manifests in children, and the witness's testimony bears the hallmarks of genuine disclosure, not coaching. Your objection is overruled. You'll have your opportunity for cross-examination." Hutchins sat down, his face flushed with anger. Sarah felt a small surge of vindication. The judge wasn't buying his dismissal. She was listening to Emma with the attention she deserved. Tom continued, his voice maintaining its gentle but clear tone. "Emma, can you tell me about the next day? What happened after the night when Daddy touched you?" "I didn't want to wake up," Emma said. "My body hurt, and I was sad. I didn't want to see Daddy. I told Mommy that Daddy touched me in a bad way." "And what did Mommy do?" "She hugged me really tight," Emma said, and her voice strengthened slightly as she spoke about her mother's response. "And she said that it wasn't my fault, and she said that she would keep me safe, and then she called the police." This was the moment that had triggered everything. Sarah's call to 911, the officers arriving at their home, the beginning of the end of their marriage, and the beginning of this long legal journey to protect their daughter. "Emma, I want to ask you something very important," Tom said slowly and deliberately. "Has anyone told you to say these things? Has anyone told you what to say to me or to the judge?" This was a critical question designed to address Hutchins's accusation of coaching. Emma shook her head firmly. "No," she said, "I'm telling the truth. Dr. Patterson said to tell the truth, and Mommy said to tell the truth, but they didn't tell me what to say, they just said to say what really happened." Tom nodded, satisfied. "And Emma, do you know what it means to lie?" "Yes," Emma said. "It's when you say something that isn't true." "Are you lying to me right now?" "No," Emma said emphatically. "I'm telling the truth." "How do you know you're telling the truth?" Emma looked down at Duke and her small hand continued to stroke his fur. "Because it all happened. I remember it. My body remembers it. And Duke knows I'm telling the truth. Dogs know when people are telling the truth." There were several soft sounds from the gallery, quiet sobs, whispered words. Even hardened court observers were moved by the profound simplicity of a child's faith in the animal beside her. Tom turned to look at Judge Morrison. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "We'll take a brief recess before cross-examination. Court is in recess for 10 minutes." The gavel came down, and immediately, Officer Martinez moved toward the witness stand. The opposing counsel stood and began gathering his papers, his expression thoughtful and calculating. He was preparing his strategy for cross-examination, a moment when he would attempt to undermine Emma's testimony through aggressive questioning. Sarah wanted to run to Emma, to pull her daughter from that chair and take her somewhere safe. But the rules of the courtroom prevented that. Instead, she watched as Officer Martinez helped Emma down from the stand and positioned Duke so the dog could move with her. Emma's eyes immediately found her mother in the gallery, and Sarah nodded reassuringly, mouthing, "You're doing so good, baby, so good." Emma managed a small smile before being led to the witness waiting room for the recess. The cross-examination. When court reconvened, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Richard Hutchins stood and buttoned his jacket, a deliberate gesture designed to project authority and confidence. He was a skilled cross-examiner who'd built a reputation on dismantling witness testimony, but he'd never faced a witness quite like Emma. Emma, he began, his tone noticeably different from Tom's gentle approach, sharper, more challenging. You're 3 years old, correct? Yes, Emma said, her hand immediately finding Duke's fur again. And you understand the difference between what's real and what you imagined. Yes, Emma said, though her hesitation was noticeable. So if I told you that I saw a unicorn in this courtroom, that would be real, correct? No, Emma said, with the certainty that only a 3-year-old could muster. Unicorns aren't real. That would be you being silly. There was a slight sound from the gallery, barely suppressed laughter at Emma's straightforward logic. Hutchins's jaw tightened. Emma, isn't it true that you spend a lot of time with your mother, and your mother doesn't like your father very much? Objection, Tom called out, argumentative and leading. Sustained, Judge Morrison said. Hutchins rephrased, do you know if your mother likes your father? No, Emma said. Mommy cries a lot. She cries about Daddy. So your mother is sad about your father, and you want to make your mother happy, don't you? Emma looked confused. I don't know what you mean. If you tell the judge that Daddy did bad things, your mother will be happy with you, won't she? Tom stood immediately. Your Honor, this is witness intimidation and an inappropriate question for a 3-year-old witness. Judge Morrison's eyes flashed with anger. Counsel, I'm warning you. Rephrase your questions appropriately or I'll declare you in contempt of court. This is a 3-year-old child, not a hostile adult witness. Hutchins backed off, but he continued his questioning, trying various approaches to get Emma to admit she'd been influenced or had misremembered events. But Emma remained steadfast. With Duke at her side, she answered each question with surprising clarity and consistency. She didn't become flustered. She didn't contradict herself. She simply told the truth as she'd experienced it. When Hutchins finally finished, nearly 45 minutes later, he seemed defeated. Emma had not only survived his cross-examination, she'd thrived under it. Every answer had reinforced her credibility. No further questions, Hutchins said quietly, sitting down with obvious frustration. Judge Morrison looked at Emma with what Sarah could only describe as respect. Emma, you've been very brave today. The court commends you. You may step down. Officer Martinez helped Emma from the witness stand, and this time as they descended the steps, Emma's head was held high. She'd done it. Against all odds, through her trauma and fear, with the help of a remarkable dog, she told her truth. And that truth was going to change the course of her entire life. The courtroom doors had barely closed behind them when Sarah's phone began to buzz. First one message, then another, then a flood of notifications from numbers she didn't recognize. She silenced her phone, thinking it was spam, but something told her to check later. For now, all that mattered was holding Emma, telling her how proud she was, and getting her daughter somewhere safe and quiet where she could process what had just happened. But the courthouse had other plans. As Sarah, Emma, and Officer Martinez walked toward the exit, a woman with a camera and a microphone suddenly appeared in their path. Behind her stood a cameraman with professional equipment. Are you Sarah Chen? The woman asked, her eyes bright with the hunger of someone who just caught wind of a significant story. I'm Veronica Torres from Channel 7 News. I was in the courtroom observing the trial, and I have to say, what we just witnessed was extraordinary. Would you be willing to comment on your daughter's testimony? Sarah's first instinct was to decline. Emma had been through enough without having to deal with media attention. But before she could respond, Officer Martinez stepped forward diplomatically. The witness in this case is a minor, he said firmly. We won't be commenting on her testimony or her identity. However, I can tell you that this case demonstrates the effectiveness of facility dogs in supporting vulnerable witnesses in legal proceedings. The reporter's eyes lit up. A story about a police dog helping a child testify. That was even better than the custody case angle. Within hours, Veronica Torres had filed a story titled, Police Dog Helps 3-Year-Old Find Her Voice in Custody Battle. The story ran on the evening news that night, though Sarah had specifically asked that Emma's face not be shown on camera. The news station had complied, focusing instead on footage of Duke in the courtroom, Officer Martinez explaining the facility dog program, and Judge Morrison giving a brief statement about trauma-informed justice practices. But in today's interconnected world, one local news story doesn't stay local for long. By the next morning, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. By afternoon, it had gone national. News stations from coast to coast were running segments titled, "Service Dog Helps Child Testify in Court, The Power of Dogs in the Judicial System," and "When Words Fail, a Dog's Presence Speaks Volumes." Sarah's phone, which she'd turned back on that evening, began to ring constantly. Media outlets wanted interviews. True crime podcasters wanted to discuss the case. Child psychology experts wanted to weigh in on the effectiveness of facility animals in trauma recovery. For a family that had desperately wanted privacy, the sudden attention was overwhelming. But something unexpected happened as the story spread. People began to relate to it in profound and personal ways. Messages flooded in from survivors of childhood sexual abuse who'd never been able to testify, who'd suffered in silence because they couldn't find the courage or the words. They thanked Sarah for allowing Emma's story to be shared, for showing the world that children's voices mattered, that trauma could be overcome, that recovery was possible. A woman named Patricia from Michigan wrote, "I was abused as a child, and when I tried to testify at trial, I completely fell apart. The judge dismissed my testimony as unreliable. Reading about your daughter's courage makes me wish I'd had a Duke to help me. You're giving hope to so many of us." Another message came from a man named David. "I've been a therapist for 20 years, and I've never seen a more powerful demonstration of the healing potential of human-animal bonds. This case is going to change how we approach trauma in this country." The Columbus courthouse began receiving inquiries from other judicial districts across Ohio. Judges wanted to know how to implement facility dog programs. Law enforcement agencies wanted to know how to train dogs for this purpose. Schools reached out asking if Officer Martinez would come speak to their students about the program. Judge Patricia Morrison, moved by the overwhelming response, decided to become an advocate. She gave interviews to national media outlets discussing trauma-informed judicial practices and the importance of supporting vulnerable witnesses. She testified before the Ohio State Legislature about the need for expanded facility dog programs in family court proceedings. "What we witnessed in that courtroom," Judge Morrison told a legislative committee, "was a child accessing her own courage with the help of a trained animal. That's not a legal technicality, that's justice. Real, authentic justice that centers the needs of the most vulnerable among us." The Ohio legislature, moved by Judge Morrison's testimony and the public support that had been generated by Emma's story, passed House Bill 247, the Duke's Law, legislation that mandated the availability of facility dogs in all family court proceedings involving child testimony. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Officer Martinez became something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles. He was invited to speak at police academies across the country about the K9 Companions program and the impact facility dogs could have on vulnerable witnesses. News outlets ran human interest stories about his partnership with Duke, about the years of training, about the bond between handler and dog. But what moved Officer Martinez most were the personal stories he received. A woman named Jennifer wrote, "My daughter was afraid to testify against her abuser. We saw your story on the news and reached out to our courthouse about facility dogs. With a dog's help, my daughter finally told her truth. Thank you for what you and Duke do." The K9 Companions organization, which trained facility dogs for courthouse use, received such an influx of requests and donations that they had to expand their operations significantly. They opened new training facilities and hired additional trainers. Dogs that might have otherwise been trained for other purposes were now being dedicated to supporting vulnerable witnesses in legal proceedings. Social media became filled with stories of people sharing their own experiences with courtroom trauma, with animals that had helped them heal, with the realization that recovery was possible. Hashtags like Duke's Story and Facility Dogs for Justice began trending. Emma, though she was only 3 years old and didn't fully understand the magnitude of what she'd accomplished, became a symbol of childhood resilience and the power of speaking truth. Children's advocacy organizations cited her case in their fundraising materials. Universities added discussions of her testimony to their curriculum in courses about trauma, family law, and human-animal interaction. Sarah received messages from parents struggling with custody battles asking for advice, for hope, for reassurance that their children's voices would be heard. She found herself answering emails late into the night, telling their stories, directing them toward resources, sharing what she'd learned from her own painful journey. The opposing counsel's law firm quietly settled several pending cases after the publicity around Emma's testimony. Judges across the state began citing Emma's case as precedent for trauma-informed practices in their own courtrooms. Defense attorneys who'd previously relied on dismissing vulnerable witnesses as unreliable began changing their tactics. One unexpected consequence: several other family dogs in Columbus began being trained as informal emotional support animals in their households, as parents who'd been inspired by Duke's story sought ways to provide comfort and stability to their own traumatized children. Emma's story had done something remarkable. It had taken a deeply personal tragedy and transformed it into a catalyst for systemic change. Not through legislation or policy papers or academic research, though all of those were involved, but through the simple, profound act of a child telling her truth with the help of an animal that understood her pain. By the time the dust had settled, 3 months after that day in the courtroom, the landscape of family law in Ohio had fundamentally shifted. Facility dogs were no longer seen as experimental or unconventional. They were now recognized as essential tools for ensuring that vulnerable witnesses, particularly children, could access their own voices and tell their truths in ways that the formal legal system had previously prevented. And it had all started with a 3-year-old girl, a German shepherd named Duke, and a judge willing to take a chance on compassion. The waiting was the hardest part. After Emma's testimony, after the cross-examination, after the media frenzy had begun to die down, Sarah and Emma found themselves in a strange limbo. The ruling wouldn't come for several weeks. Judge Morrison had indicated she needed time to review all the evidence, consider the testimony, and render a decision that would stand up to any potential appeal. Sarah tried to maintain normalcy for Emma. They went to preschool, they played in the park, they read bedtime stories, but underneath it all, Sarah was living in a state of anxious anticipation. She kept replaying Emma's testimony in her mind, searching for any moment of doubt, any phrase that might have undermined their case. Had Emma been clear enough? Had the judge truly believed her? Or would some legal technicality overturn everything? 3 weeks after the testimony, Tom Richardson called with news. Judge Morrison had issued her ruling. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the email he forwarded, the official court document that would determine her and Emma's future. The words seemed to blur on the screen at first, and then suddenly they came into sharp focus. Based on the testimony of the minor child, the investigative findings, the professional evaluations, and the preponderance of evidence presented, this court finds that the defendant engaged in child sexual abuse. The court further finds that supervised visitation with appropriate safeguards is in the best interest of the minor child. Full legal and physical custody is awarded to the mother, Sarah Chen. The defendant is ordered to participate in sex offender treatment and psychological evaluation before any contact with the minor is permitted. Sarah read the words 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. She had won. Emma had won. The truth had prevailed. She called Tom immediately, tears streaming down her face. "We won," she whispered. "We actually won." "You did more than win," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "You changed the system." Judge Morrison's ruling specifically commended the use of the facility dog in enabling the child to testify, and she's recommended that the court continue to utilize this resource in future cases involving vulnerable witnesses. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal paperwork, therapy sessions, and the slow, gradual process of rebuilding their lives. Emma began to heal in ways that had seemed impossible just weeks before. She stopped having nightmares as frequently. She began to smile more genuinely. She started to reclaim the childhood that had been stolen from her. But there was one person Sarah and Emma both wanted to see, one being who had made all of this possible. 3 weeks later, the final hearing before the court was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, a routine status conference to ensure all the custody orders were being followed and to set guidelines for supervised visitation with the father. Sarah didn't expect anything dramatic. This was just paperwork, just procedure. But as she and Emma walked through the courthouse doors that morning, Sarah's eyes scanned the hallway, hopping against hope. And then she saw them. Officer Martinez stood near the main entrance, Duke on a leash beside him. The dog's ears perked up the moment he saw Emma, and his tail began to wag with genuine joy, the kind of enthusiastic greeting reserved for those you genuinely care about. Emma froze, her eyes widening. "Duke," she cried out, her voice filled with pure delight. "Mommy, it's Duke." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she watched her daughter run toward the dog. This time, there was no fear in Emma's steps, no hesitation, no trauma. There was only joy, the joy of reunion with a being who had saved her, who had made her brave. Emma threw her arms around Duke's neck, and the dog gently leaned into her embrace, his tail wagging so hard his entire back end was moving. Officer Martinez crouched beside them, smiling with the warmth of someone who understood exactly what this moment meant. "I wanted to make sure we got to see you before we left," Officer Martinez said to Emma, though his eyes were on Sarah. "Duke's been thinking about you a lot." "I've been thinking about Duke too," Emma said, burying her face in the dog's fur. "Duke helped me be brave." "He did," Officer Martinez agreed. "And you know what? You helped Duke be brave too. That's what real friends do, they help each other be brave." Sarah stood watching the interaction, feeling something shift inside her. This was closure. This was confirmation that what Emma had experienced wasn't just trauma, it was also transformation. She'd survived something terrible, and in the process, she discovered her own resilience. Judge Morrison appeared in the hallway, having apparently arranged this meeting beforehand. When she saw Emma with Duke, she smiled, a genuine, warm smile that was entirely different from her judicial demeanor. "Emma," the judge said, kneeling down to the child's level, "I wanted to tell you that you changed the law. Do you know what that means?" Emma shook her head, her hand still buried in Duke's fur. "It means that other children who are scared like you were scared will now have a dog like Duke to help them be brave too. You helped so many people, Emma. You should be very proud." Emma looked up at the judge, then at Officer Martinez, then at her mother. She seemed to understand on some level that something significant had happened, something that went beyond her own story, her own healing. "I'm glad," Emma said simply. "I'm glad other kids will have Duke help them." The hearing itself was brief and uneventful. The judge confirmed the custody arrangement, outlined the supervised visitation schedule, and formally commended Sarah for her strength and advocacy on behalf of her daughter. As Sarah and Emma left the courtroom that day, the judge added one final comment. "This case has profoundly changed my understanding of justice. Thank you for reminding me that true justice isn't just about following procedure. It's about protecting the most vulnerable among us and ensuring their voices are heard. Your daughter is an inspiration to us all. 6 months later, Sarah sat in the waiting room of Dr. Patterson's office for what would be Emma's final therapy session. Her daughter had made remarkable progress. The nightmares had stopped. She'd regained her appetite. She was laughing again, playing with other children, engaging with the world with the openness and curiosity that should characterize a 3-year-old. Dr. Patterson emerged with Emma, and the therapist's expression was hopeful. "Emma is doing wonderfully," she told Sarah. "She's processed her trauma in a healthy way, she's developed strong coping skills, and she's building a secure attachment with you. I think we can safely conclude her formal therapy at this point. Of course, she can always return if she needs additional support in the future." As they drove home that afternoon, Emma fell asleep in her car seat, her favorite stuffed bunny tucked against her chest. Sarah glanced over at her daughter and felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Emma had survived. They had both survived. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected email from Officer Martinez. It contained a photo, Emma and Duke, taken that day in the courthouse hallway. Emma's face was radiant with joy, and Duke's eyes seemed to reflect that same happiness. The email read, "I wanted you to have this photo. It captures something really special, a child who found her courage and a dog who helped her access it. Duke and I are heading to the National Law Enforcement K9 Conference next month, and they want us to present on the facility dog program. We're including Emma's case as our primary example. I hope that's okay with you. Her story is genuinely changing how people think about justice, trauma, and healing. Thank you for trusting us to be part of your journey." Sarah printed the photo and placed it in a frame on Emma's nightstand, a daily reminder for her daughter of the bravery she'd shown, of the animal who'd believed in her, and of the truth that sometimes the most profound acts of courage require support, compassion, and unconditional love. 1 year later, Emma was now 4 years old, and she'd started kindergarten at a new school where nobody knew her history, where she was just a bright, curious, kind little girl who loved dogs and painting and helping her friends. She talked about Duke sometimes, but not with the weight of trauma, with the lightness of remembering a good friend. Sarah had started working with a nonprofit organization focused on improving services for child abuse survivors in the court system. She gave talks about her experience, about the importance of trauma-informed justice, and about the surprising power of human-animal bonds in healing. The facility dog program in Ohio had expanded beyond her wildest dreams. 23 courthouses now had certified facility dogs. 17 other states had passed similar legislation inspired by Duke's Law. The K9 Companions organization had become a national leader in training dogs specifically for courthouse support. Officer Martinez and Duke were traveling the country, speaking at law enforcement conferences, training facilities, and universities about their work. Duke had helped over 40 vulnerable witnesses testify in court proceedings, and the dog had been nominated for several animal service awards. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came on a sunny Saturday afternoon, when Sarah received a phone call from Officer Martinez. "We're going to be in your area next weekend for a presentation at the courthouse," he said. "I was wondering if you and Emma might want to come by and see us. Duke's been asking about you." That Saturday, Sarah and Emma met Officer Martinez and Duke at the courthouse. This time, there was no formality, no fear, no trauma, just a happy reunion between a little girl and a dog who'd changed her life. As Emma played with Duke in the courthouse hallway, laughing with uninhibited joy, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: peace. Real, genuine, hard-won peace. Emma had been broken, but she hadn't stayed broken. She'd found her voice, told her truth, and in doing so, she'd healed herself and changed the world. And it had all started with the simple, profound realization that sometimes, when words fail and courage falters, All you need is a faithful companion with 4 legs and a wagging tail to remind you that you're braver than you know. As the sun began to set over the courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors, Sarah watched her daughter embrace the dog who'd saved her. In that moment, she understood the true meaning of justice, not punishment or procedure, but healing, protection, and the restoration of a child's right to be safe, to be heard, and to reclaim the innocence that had been stolen from her. And they all lived on, carrying the memory of that day in court when a little girl found her voice and changed everything.